town people who volunteer or work for the town, like, don't have to pay for disposal of certain things. So, 'cause, like, news to me.
Yeah, it was town employees, so I was on the planning board.
Is it employees only?
Yeah.
So I won't
So I was
wanna
on the
do it.
planning board, and and then when I was in the select board, I just paid anyway.
Yeah, okay.
But, because
I had never heard of that, so knowing that, I will insist on paying next time. But it doesn't happen all that often,
We
but.
have a quorum, I guess, huh?
Five is a quorum,
Yeah.
yeah. We are, we can, it's up to you if you want to wait a minute
We've
or.
not heard from other people?
I think I talked to Rebecca a couple of weeks ago at the last meeting. I think she said she wasn't going to make it to tonight.
I think, was Mark
And
the one
Mark
we-
said he's going to be in New York.
Yep.
She, where's all my notes and stuff?
Sue, me, and John, we have meetings almost every day.
Oh my God.
Lately.
Indeed.
Recording in progress.
On record.
Feel self-conscious now. All right.
All right, I'll bring the mic back in.
So I was looking here, so me, Rebecca, sign here, Phil, Neil Blank,
Oh.
Susan.
I don't think we have a quorum.
Okay, and we got mine.
Get enough of
Hey,
it.
that's- so we're good.
Yeah, and we got Neil too. Probably.
Yeah, I thought I saw you, and I was like,
A
I
member.
was just imagining that, but you are here.
Yeah, I evaporated. had to get moisturized.
All right. So, are we all set to go? All right, so it is 6:31, and I call the meeting of the Plymouth Planning Board of December 1st to order. So I'm going to read the roll. Rebecca, absent. Phil,
Present?
Neil,
Present.
Mike,
Here?
Mark is excused. Susan,
Here?
and then alternates, Zach Terrell of the Select Board, Michael Bouchard,
Present.
and Peter Julia is absent. And myself, I am present. All right, so first up is the review of minutes from our meeting of November 17th. So hopefully you'll have a copy, and if you haven't already, have a look at them.
Do we want to see Michael Bouchard as well?
Oh, yes, I'm sorry, you're right.
This is.
Um,
Oh, that's something.
Call Joseph.
Oh,
Mike,
I gotta go.
you will be seated as a voting member this evening.
Thank you, I accept.
You should go get him. Good night.
So I just noticed on page 3, they're very minor. I can count the number of lines down. It's actually the third line down on the third paragraph, allowing notice to be sent as opposed to send. Big consequential changes there.
Mhm.
Um,
Noted.
I didn't notice any other changes.
Anything else?
I'll move we approve the minutes with the one edit as noted.
Second.
Okay, so we have a motion and a second to approve the minutes with one edit. Any further discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? And abstentions? Okay, so the minutes are approved. So do we have any public comments this evening not related to business on the agenda? Oh, okay. Have there been communications received by the board?
Yes, there have been a number of communications received by the board, but those mostly will be covered under another business item tonight, so we can, if you'd like, we can go over them when we get to that.
These are the extensions.
Yep.
Okay. All right, are there any committee reports? Or there's the HOP Grant Committee, but are there any other committees? No?
Any planning related updates from the select board?
No.
Okay, so I will say a few words about the HOP Grant Committee. I think the last time we met, we had already chosen 4 individuals four firms, I should say, to talk to about being
Consultant.
involved in the process as consultants. And at this point, we have met via Zoom with 3 of them. And these were the 3 most promising candidates. And we had some good discussions. These were half-hour Zoom meetings, so not a whole lot of detail can be gotten to in a half hour. And we have decided to bring 2 of them back for face-to-face interviews. And that will be taking place not next week, but the week after, on Monday and Tuesday. And that's where the process stands right now. I'll remind everybody, except for those interviews, which will be a little bit different, meet on Tuesday mornings, and the meetings are open to the public. And Joseph or other, Sue, Mike, anything else you'd want to add?
Nope.
Okay.
I covered it.
Yeah, I will add one more thing. Our 2 finalists that we'll be talking to for consultants, we will be meeting on Monday and Tuesday of that week, 1 each morning, at 10:30 on Monday, I believe it is, and 9 o'clock on Tuesday. Am I remembering that correctly?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay.
Yep.
It's all been happening like today, so
Right.
the facts are still not quite squared away in my head. All right. So, new business. We have extension and waiver requests from Mike McGinley and Riverside Landing, and I believe also the Rapid City site. Joseph, is there anything you want to say before I invite the applicant up to?
I don't know if June wants to say a few words
Or
on this
June,
one.
would you like to say any words?
Hi, everybody. Good evening. Sorry, I signed in a little late. I was having some internet connection issues, but got that solved. So let's see. So we have, I just think it's important the board consider that we have 2 separate applications. They are from the same developer, an applicant, but you should probably consider taking, one at a time, would be my suggestion. And with both, there's also a request for a waiver from the town's site plan review regulations regarding some notice requirements. So I think it would be appropriate, just from the order of business, to, first consider whether you're going to waive the notice requirements, and then decide when, depending on the outcome of that, decide about the actual extension of the approval. Because if you're going to notice abutters, that would probably need to be done hopefully for either December 15th or the January meeting. So just keep in mind for a step-by-step process without getting too far into the actual request for the extension. You should first decide whether you want to grant that waiver.
And as far as December 15th or even early January, the early January itself would be an extension of the deadline of December 31st, which we could
But
consider.
the applicant got the request in prior to that, so we just have an
Okay.
issue of sort of meeting notice requirements. So if it has to go to January, that's fine, because the request was submitted in time
Okay.
before the expiration. So I don't think that's an issue. It's more just think process-wise, first consider whether you want to address the waiver before you really consider the merits of the request for the extension.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so we do have 2 requests, and perhaps we could start with Riverside Landing. And so we do have, as June mentioned, a request for a waiver of the notification, about our notifications, and a request for an extension. Would the applicant like to, June?
Yeah, I forgot to also mention something. I told you, John, I was going to mention that, my apologies. Just as we get into this, the board should be aware that we also have another applicant whose same timeline. Their approval is expiring in December, and they have also submitted a request for an extension of that approval. You're not hearing that tonight because it came in just this past week, but they did not request the waiver of notification to abutters and the public. So same situation, it's for Dragonfly Properties, with the storage units off of Highland Street. We've sent notices to 3 projects that were expiring this month, so all 3 have submitted requests for waivers. Submitted requests for the extensions. 1 did not ask for any waivers on the notice requirements, and then 2 did, when those 2 you're discussing tonight.
Thank you. I'm just looking through my own notes here for everything. All right, so let's discuss the Riverside Landing request first. Would you like to say anything on your behalf?
Evening, Mike McGinley. I honestly thought that a handling of the situation in this regard, the more informal is the way I would look at it, is appropriate. And I did mention to June and to the new gentleman that the approval letters that I received for both of the projects that are now approved, namely Rap City down by Boulder Point and Riverside Landing, my approval letter, the last thing on it on one of these, and this one is on Boulder Point, it says conditional approval will expire on December 31 unless substantial progress is made on the site prior to the date. And I took that and I raised the question with Joseph and June as to whether or not I really had to go through this formal situation. Certainly the economy has caught people that are interested. They've calmed down a little bit. Hopefully in spring we will renew. Rap City for one, and also I am talking to people about Riverside Landing. So getting both renewals obviously is very important to I and the town and the people. But quite frankly, and without a lot of dialogue, because I thought I submitted 2 pretty good letters outlining my position. In the case of, and I'll be glad to show it to you, in the case of Rap City at Boulder Point Road, I look at my invoices and I see that I've invested, and I don't say this for any proud purpose, this is reality, and this is what justifies, in my opinion, the board's approval of item number 10 on this one, and I believe it's item number 6 on the other one, which is Riverside. And it's simply semantics. And at the end of your planning board meeting, when you say you expire on a given day, but then you say unless there is, a certain amount of performance, and I'm looking for that again. I believe it's called specific performance or something like that. Bear with me.
Active and substantial development.
Substantial progress. Rap City's got $62,152 of substantial progress into it. I've run the water line from the highway into the site. The electricity's there, the water's there, the sewer is there. All of the permitting is in place. Obviously, we've spent monies in engineering, and we have a business that wants to come to town. So I feel as though that I certainly have done substantial justice to get to this point where I shouldn't have to go ahead. And I'm not objecting to it, and if the board wants it that way, it's fine. But quite frankly, I think maybe the board should just make a determination as to whether or not, when an applicant gets a final letter that says unless substantial progress is made on the site prior to that date, that to me is maybe go to the planner and justify, here's what I've done, and let the planner decide whether or not that is substantial process or progress. To go ahead and go through all of this, quite frankly, is time consuming, it's costly, it takes your time, it takes my time, when in fact I can certainly, by all the invoices here, justify that serious money's gone in. The site, unfortunately, is sitting there approved Unfortunately, rates keep going up, but the gentleman still remains interested. In the case of Riverside Landing, there are people interested in that site. You have seen that I've taken down the trees, fully permitted, everything is fine. That application does expire again on December 31st. And I take the position that between Horizons Engineering, Andrews Construction, French Land Services, the Town of Plymouth, Stony Ridge Environmental, Wade Reed Logging, numerous Stony Ridge Environmentals, Town Attorney, application fees, Planning Board application, Wetlands application, that $68,765,000 to go into that site is substantial commitment to go ahead and to work with the town to bring people to the town. So I think maybe and I've never been a planning board member, but I'd almost like a decision on whether or not, for the board's sake, whether or not substantial completion is met at a certain point, or do we have to go through this all the time? And that's really it. But I did present, and then Joseph caught me on one because I didn't ask for the waiver specifically, so hopefully you all had a chance to read my email. And that's really all I have to say.
All right, thank you.
Thank
I'll
you.
let know if we have other questions. So the question before us first, I think we should take one at a time, starting with perhaps Riverside Landing, as I mentioned, is whether or not we want to grant a waiver for the public notification, and then after that, as Mike McGinley is also asking for an extension on the process. So part of the question is, have we seen then active and substantial development, and how do we define that? I will remind the board that we do have other applications and have had other applications before us, and we do have a certain track record of how we have defined active and substantial development over time, and that includes Dragonfly, Mountain Village, and other recent proposals before us. So there's a certain importance of consistency as well, in how we define those terms. Of course, we do define them more succinctly and precisely in our new regulations, which aren't in effect for this application. Are there any thoughts from the board?
Given that all of the regulations we're dealing with tonight are site plan review regulations, which are approved by our board, I don't necessarily feel too bad about bending our own rules. These are not, it's not the zoning ordinance that's approved by the town. I feel like we should adhere to that a little bit more rigidly. I think we're required to, actually. But in this situation, I would like to be sensitive to the challenge of the development task that the applicant is going through, and the unique economic situation that we've all experienced over the past few years. I don't, we have not heard from the applicant that there are any substantial changes proposed. He's simply asking for an extension. If there were changes, I would feel more strongly about noticing the public and soliciting input. But given that he's simply asking for an extension to the approval that we granted, I'm inclined myself to grant both the waiver request and the extension.
I agree with that. I think the permitting process alone the last few years has been very cumbersome. It takes a lot of time. That can hold anything up. I feel the same way.
I mean, just to play the other side for a moment, we mentioned that part of the extension process is specifically for those sorts of circumstances that hold up the process and make it take longer. And there were legitimate reasons for this to take longer. And that is why we have this extension process. And we did agree to these rules in our site plan regulations. And this is what we thought was appropriate in these sorts of circumstances when we wrote those regulations. And so that I would just put that out there as well. And I'm not sure this is, I mean, again, I think this is the kind of case why we do give extensions. And these are the rules we came up with for those extensions.
The conditions are extenuating that he's working under. He's made significant infrastructure investments, so it's quite clear that he intends to go forward. It's just that current economic conditions, building conditions are, it's unprecedented, actually.
And I don't disagree with that. I also think we have these rules in place just for these sorts of things when someone does need legitimately an extension. And this is what we agreed upon as those rules for an extension. And we do have other applications under similar circumstances that are going through the public notification process. And
Given that, I don't think I've heard anyone, so I guess the question at hand is the waiver request for public notification. I'm going to move that we grant the waiver request to not notify abutters on both the Rap City Sandwich site and the
Riverside Landing.
Pardon?
Riverside Landing.
And the
we're talking about Riverside Landing at this point, like one at a time.
Oh, you want to do one at a time?
Can we do the waiver of the and the extension at the same motion for one and then go to the next?
I would do one issue at a time. So it'll be
four
four
issues.
separate
I'll
issues.
move that we grant the waiver request for Riverside Landing.
I second it.
So we have a motion and a second to grant the waiver request for public notification. Is there any further discussion? I will point out that if the public, I don't foresee, this being an issue necessarily, and I foresee this being an easy, we never really know, but it seems like a straightforward process. But if something would come up, and the public did want to speak, we're now taking that responsibility upon ourselves to speak, rather than letting the applicant address those issues.
I think I get frequent inquiries, and people are just curious.
Yeah.
That's all.
Yeah. Again, I don't foresee this being a complicated process necessarily. I just wonder about, whether or not we should follow our regulations here.
I agree. I think if we had significant public interest when we heard the initial application, and there were, if there were abutters that were interested at the time that we thought might be interested now, but I don't seem to recall hearing much input from the public, even when we held the original hearing on this, which is one of the reasons I feel more comfortable granting the waiver for public notification for the extension.
Are there any further comments? Okay. So, just to repeat, we have a motion and a second to grant the request for a waiver of public notification. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Nay.
Okay.
Abstentions? Okay, the request is approved. And so then the question becomes the extension itself. So just to clarify with staff, if the public notification is waived, does that mean that this in fact can be extended right now this evening? Yes, okay. Just double checking that.
Yeah, I think that's up to you guys if you wanted to do that tonight or wait till the 15th and normally on the third Thursday, but you have it in front of you, so the applicant's there, so it might be efficient to just do it.
Okay. Are there any thoughts? So next up, we have the question of whether or not we do want to waive or grant the extension on the site plan. And I will note that in the letter, the applicant asked for, I believe, a two-year extension?
In these times,
Yeah, a two-year extension on the on the Riverside Landing site plan approval, and we might also want to look over the conditions of approval. The right one here? No. Yes, so are there any comments or questions amongst ourselves or for the applicant about this request for a 2-year extension? Normally, our extension would be for 1 year, according to our regulations. Approved site plans shall lapse if active and substantial building or development has not begun within 1 year from the date the planning board or if conditions of approval have not been met within 1 year. I'm sorry, there it is. I'm on the wrong letter here. Approved site plans may, for reasonable cause, be extended once for a period of no more than 1 year by the board. And further down, it says something about further extensions as well. But our regulations do say that an extension will be for 1 year. Yes.
So John, I was on the planning board during those times when we were, and on the select board when we were doing everything we could to entice Market Basket to come to Plymouth. And it's not something you just go out and sign some papers and it just happens. So I am very cognizant of the fact that what the developer, I could never do what they do. And my hat's off to anybody that can do what that gentleman does. And if it's not in our regs now, we need to allow for more time, especially these times. So to me, it's an easy decision to make that he needs more time. And for the town that is getting the benefit that we are from what's already happened to help our tax rate, we need to do everything we can to ease the burden. And so I'm in favor of a 2-year extension.
Okay. Other members of the board?
I'll move the motion to grant a 2-year extension for
Second.
Riverside Landing.
Okay, so we have a motion and a second to grant a 2-year extension for Riverside Landing. Is there any further discussion?
The only discussion that I would like to share is that, one of the reasons we limit the term of extension, and one of the theories is we want to, we don't want any, if we were to change the zoning ordinance, any previously approved plans are allowed to be continued under the original terms of approval. I don't see that we're considering significant changes to that zone. And even if we were to propose changes, the applicant might have to reapply under the new terms if they had not moved forward. But I don't see that that's going to happen, and I'm willing.
The other point I would
Yeah.
make is that another benefit of the 1 year is, again, I don't think the goal is to prevent an extension from happening, and recognizing the benefits of the developments that are being proposed and built and how they might benefit the town. But if the process does take longer than anticipated, it's not a bad idea for the board to be able to check in and see what's happening and have an official meeting checking in to see what's happening, rather than having it kind of just out there for 2 years is a pretty long time, and I know this all takes time. But it does give us the ability to kind of check in on the process. And 2 years does become a long development time not to be, just to have that check-in.
At the same time, I mean, if things are moving forward as proposed, you know, I don't think we should need to check in, but, you know, if, it's also possible that the applicant may have interest from a particular party that would be interested in setting up a venue there, and you know, they may even have changes, and those changes would necessitate that they come back too. So, you know, anything substantially different than what we've already approved, we would see them in the interim for a change anyway. So, you know, I think I feel fairly confident moving forward, and
And there's no building permit for Riverside
not
either,
yet.
so they'll be back.
Well, they'll be into the town, but
The
not
town.
to us.
So the town will have some sort of,
Mhm.
Yeah.
And in fact, I believe the original site plan did not include buildings. It did not get that far, yeah. Are there any further discussion? Okay, so we have a motion and a second to grant an extension for 2 years. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Abstentions? Okay, the extension is granted.
Thank you very much.
And we still have, that was for
Riverside.
Riverside Landing. We haven't done Rhapsody.
So I make a motion that we give a waiver for the, waiver for noticing the butters for Rap City.
A second.
Okay, so we have a motion and a second to waive abutter notifications and public notice for Rap City. Is there further discussion? Okay. All those in favor?
Aye.
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 Opposed? Nay. Abstentions? Okay, it's the motion is approved.
Make a motion that we give a 2-year extension for Rap City.
I'll second.
Okay, so we have a motion and a second to give a 2-year extension of the site plan approval for Rap City. Is there further discussion? Okay. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? Okay, the motion is approved.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your time.
If anything changes, let us know. Have a nice day.
June wants to
June
speak.
wants-
June has a
June,
question.
yes.
So I tried to send a message to Joseph. Did the butter notices go out yet for the other request from Dragonfly, Joseph?
Yes.
They did, okay. I was just thinking about equity, but it's already done, so that's fine. We can work with that, so. Thank you.
Okay. I would reiterate, it's important, I think, to keep those issues in mind about all applicants being treated equitably and keeping our standards fairly consistent across applications.
I do remember when that application came in, there were some abutters that came in and
Yeah.
expressed concerns about that particular one, Dragonfly. So I think, you know,
Okay.
if you wanted to talk about that one at, you know, at that point, this one had people were very enthusiastic about it, actually, so, like you were saying before.
I agree. I think that's, good reason to
Different
to
situation.
notify the abutters in this situation.
Yep.
So next up, we have zoning amendments under consideration for 2023, and I believe we are in the process, or staff is in the process of finalizing the language on those. We had one change last time having to do with the residential setbacks, making them by special exception. And I had another second thought about that one, but I probably shouldn't even go there at this late of a date. I was actually just wondering, since we were doing it by special exception anyway, if we had talked about the fact that several lots, especially closer to downtown in the residential area, are in fact less than 15. And if 10 by special exception, since there is without the special exception, 10 would not work at all. I was just wondering, with the special exception, if we could even make that smaller, or should we just keep it at 15? Since we've kind of all decided upon that already anyway, rather than reopening the can of worms. Because there were some, I think you had measured a bunch that were at like 10 and 12 and
Yep.
and such.
Yep, certainly. Some in the downtown area.
I'm not sure how much room there even is for infill development in those sorts of places. Although if somebody like had a property that came down and there was too much lapse time and wanted to rebuild or something, I don't know. Anyway, that's the one thing that kind of crossed my mind. But I suppose the longer we think about this, the more things will cross our mind. So maybe we could just stick with the 15 too.
I would say that, this is probably a good time, if we do have thoughts about things, this is probably a good time to, hammer those out. We'll be looking to send out, public notice, public hearings for zoning amendments, later in December. So this is still an opportunity. We haven't published notice for any
Yep.
of these yet in any, form that's, presented here. So what I can do if you want, pull up I sent out that draft zoning ordinance with the changes in it. If we all wanted, I could pull it up and look
Sure,
at it
sure.
on the screen, and we could, sort of go through one at a time, just, refresh where we've been, what we've all sort of looked at and agreed upon prior to this meeting. I know we've sort of already discussed them, but this is just a chance to see them in how they could look in the text of the ordinance. So, and apologies if it's hard to see on that screen, but I'll try to
Keep going, you're good.
clarify when we get there and zoom in if I can. So, all right, so the first real change here is in the setback table. We had a couple that were proposed. I guess we'll go sort of, these are pretty self-explanatory in terms of how they appear in the text. It's just changing the numbers that are in the setback table to what the board discussed. These are the single and multifamily residential, allowing 15 feet by special exception. It's certainly, it's just a matter of changing one number. If the
Yeah.
board did agree to go to 10, I
I mean,
think
15 made perfect sense without the special exception, because you wouldn't want to make it too small. But since that process is in place anyway with the zoning board, I was just thinking maybe you could even go a little bit shorter.
yeah,
If the board wants to, of course, I don't know.
I know that we, have no problem updating that. Like I said, we haven't put this language out formally yet. We haven't set the process
Is
in
that
motion.
just village commercial?
So the village commercial was a separate, I'll go to that one next, but this is the single and multifamily residential, currently 30-foot minimum front setback, and this is the amendment to consider allowing it to go down to 15 feet by special exception, particularly, thinking about a lot of these in-town lots, places where the average setback on a street might be 15 feet or 12 feet, 18 feet, less than 30. There are many cases, but we tossed around a couple of different ideas, but ended up settling on leaving the default minimum at 30, but allowing it to go down to 15 by special exception. But again, it would be an easy change either way, 15 or 10, I think is
I don't feel really strongly about the 10. it crossed my mind as an opportunity.
I don't think it's a bad idea. I mean, it does open up the door. You know, there could be a street where the average setback is 16 feet and somebody, you know, applying to rebuild or expand could then go closer, which, you know.
And they still have to get it approved, though, from the zoning board.
Right,
That it fits
but if
the
there's,
character of the neighborhood, so
Yeah.
it still might not get
Sure.
10.
as long as it has to meet the character of the neighborhood and things, you know, as long as there are those criteria, I would feel more confident opening it up.
June, did you have a comment?
I guess I would advise sticking with the 15 if there's a few houses, you know, or buildings that are, say, at 10, setting something back, you know, if they got a 15-foot by special exception, that 5-foot difference isn't that great. I mean, it's a much bigger difference between sort of the 30 to 15 than between 5 and 10. So I think in most cases, based on our analysis, that the 15 would probably be the best for the community, you know, provided that they can meet the special exception criteria. And, you know, that extra 5 isn't, it almost could create more problems because there's a much, you're now potentially having a bigger difference between 30 and somebody being only 10 feet away, you know. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. Your value is, or your experience
yeah.
in the realm has a great deal of value when we're discussing this, so thank you.
Yeah, I was actually just, for personal reasons, measuring out sort of the setback, you know, or a distance today, and, you know, realize that 5 feet really isn't that much. You know, visually, it's kind of, 15 feet's a lot, you know, between 30 and 15, but between 5 and 15, I mean, 10 and 15 wouldn't really be so visibly different.
Yeah, so, I mean, I'm fine keeping it at 15.
Okay.
So, you know, the next sort of,
Do we want to touch on the village commercial at 0 while we're there?
yeah, the village commercial is sort of a two-parter. You know, dropping the minimum front setback. Right now, the front setbacks in village commercial, minimum is 10 or 15 feet, and it's can be dropped to 0 by special exception. Obviously, there are many buildings that are much less than 15, and, you know, we sort of talked about maintaining that, you know, traditional village character as opposed to some of the more, you know, further setback buildings that this might encourage that, you know, sort of goes against maybe the more pedestrian-friendly feel, sort of having the parking in front, whereas this might encourage more parking to the sides and rear of the building by reducing the minimum setback to 0. Doesn't preclude someone from setting it back further, of course, but, you know, that's where it came in to add a maximum front setback in the village commercial zone of 10 feet. So this would be saying that set it back between 0 and 10 feet in the village commercial zone.
And I would add to that as well that it's a character issue, and if you look at the southern end of Main Street, it's also a safety issue with all the parking in the front of the buildings and these enormous curb cuts and not very hospitable sidewalks.
So as with the last one, this is pretty straightforward how it looks in the ordinance. It's pretty much, you know, just changing some numbers in a table. Actually, the 0 there is blue, but not, that's already the case. We decided not to change the rear setbacks, so that's just it was a typo being fixed that shows up as blue, but it's just adding another row underneath with the maximum setback of 10 feet in the village commercial only. Unless anyone has any thoughts about how that's shown. I think the ones in the table are pretty, you know, it's just numbers in a table that are being changed, but the more textual ones will be more important to look at closely. So the next one is the height in the village commercial, actually specifically the height on Main Street. We talked about, you know, building Main Street, a lot of small lots, steep slopes. You know, the method that right now is used to measure the 35-foot maximum height might not work so well on Main Street. So this allows you to measure that 35 feet from Main Street, which, again, it's just adding a bullet underneath that 35 feet saying that you may alternatively measure it from Main Street. I don't know if anyone in their review had any thoughts about this.
The only thought I do have about this is, if you're looking at the backside of the monkey, for example,
Mhm.
it's basically, if I recall, it's single story at Main Street, but the back is substantial. If that were to be 35 feet at Main Street, the back would be closer to 70 or 80, I think,
I think it's 65 to 70
as
right
it
now.
is. But that's with one story at the front.
Mhm. Yeah,
So,
I'm
I
not
mean,
sure the
if they were to
height.
go to 35 feet at Main Street there, it would be a towering building from,
Could you imagine the other side of the street? They measure 25 from the back side. The front of Main Street could be 70, 80, 90 feet.
except that this specifies the limit is 35 feet from Main Street.
It's the other way around.
So nothing, when you're standing on Main Street, nothing could be taller than 35 feet as measured
At
from the
Main
level
Street.
of Main Street.
Currently, on the other side of the street, if you measure by the current standards, you can actually probably go to about 45, 50 feet.
Yeah, right
By
now.
the current zoning ordinance.
Right now, it's measured from the average finished grade of land surrounding the building.
Oh,
This
right.
would say 35 feet measured from
Main
Main
Street
Street,
specifically, and it's just along Main Street.
just along Main.
And one of the historical reasons for the 35 feet was fire,
Ladder,
which is not really an issue anymore.
ladders
Yeah,
True.
ladder trucks and stuff, yeah.
and pumpers.
Yeah.
Now we have skyworkers.
I still think it's, the fire protection is one element that may have limited our ability to approve taller buildings in the past. But I still think that there's a character issue that the 35-foot height limit benefits.
I think there's a character issue that the current 35-foot limit limits on Main Street, where we do historically have fairly dense development with multi-story buildings. And currently, you really can't get more than like one story off of that side of Main with the 35 feet measured from the average.
No, but if we were to go to 35 feet from Main Street,
Yeah, it would be a larger building in the back.
yeah. I just, I would hesitate. I thought you were proposing allowing taller buildings.
They would be somewhat taller than they currently are, potentially, if somebody wanted to do that. It's, I mean, in my personal opinion, I don't necessarily see that as added character. I think it is in keeping with the character of historic Main Street to have more than single-story buildings on there. And we even have more than like 35-foot buildings, frankly, in downtown that were built before the ordinance.
The other, thinking about new development, I think there are allowances in the building code that allow for 2 stories of residential over 1 story of commercial.
Mhm.
And it tends to be a pretty popular, fairly economical way to build, to get both, retail, first floor retail or commercial space and, second and third floor residential, and that, it's still,
I would say
still
this-
would be allowed if someone chose to develop that way.
And this
along
this
Main
change would make that, in fact, easier to accomplish.
Street. No, I agree. I think, so I'm in support of this.
I think the city of Concord has a similar type situation with a height restriction on Main Street and Store Street. They have, pretty tall buildings.
I mean, it's not like if this gets approved, like all of a sudden it's going to be like skyscrapers in downtown Plymouth.
Trump Tower.
So, unless there are any other comments about the way that's shown, just as a, side to the height measurement that's already there,
I like it.
we'll just go on to the next one here. Just a little ways down.
My only concern is that we're missing a few members tonight and we're not getting feedback from the entire board, but.
Well, we've gotten feedback on
True.
many occasions throughout this process.
Yeah, these
I
are
know Rebecca's been.
Yeah, we've done a
active and
walk.
we've talked about it before.
yeah, and these are only the ones that the board has already agreed on and said. We sort of went down a list previously.
Yeah.
This is just looking at how the amendments that the 7 or 8 amendments that the board agreed on in the
Yep.
past would
Yeah.
fit in the could potentially fit.
There's been lots of discussion about this already.
Yeah, so this is the infamous chicken amendment. So right now, chickens, this would allow chickens in the single-family
roosters.
residential. It's pretty straightforward. We discussed a couple of different things like the number of chickens, things like that. I feel like that was probably the biggest one we discussed.
Well, I guess there wasn't really a discussion. It was a universal agreement that no roosters.
Yes, no roosters, certainly in
Female,
there.
domestic female chickens.
Yes.
Yep. This is worded in such a way, and, you know, it was in the, sort of the packet I emailed out, allow up to 10 female chickens of any breed as an accessory to a single-family home in the single-family residential district. You know, there's a lot of desire, I think, to have this, and it, you know, has a couple of reasonable restrictions. I think the board felt that the limitations were pretty reasonable, not too onerous, to allow, you know, the domestic keeping of chickens, and some, you know, manure should be stored and closed.
Is that just village or
Single
single,
family.
Yep.
single, multifamily?
Yep.
Just single family.
Single
Single family only?
Yep, that's right.
I didn't realize we had gone up on the number to 10.
Yeah,
was
we considered 5, I think,
They-
and ultimately we
They talked
decided
about
10 was still
being
reasonable.
impossible.
I know a few neighbors that have more than 5. It doesn't bother me.
And you still have to abide by other ordinances as well about safety and health and noise and.
Yeah, I think, actually, I think, Michael, you had mentioned something about you buy in blocks of 5, is that right? This would let you buy 2 blocks of 5.
Assuming everything lives and.
I don't think it's, I mean, again, I don't think it's too late if the board wanted to change that number, but I think that sort of seemed to be what the board settled on in the past.
We have to have something for discussion, and, you know, I think if the public feels strongly we did have one member of the public who commented that they, you know, already had an excess of 20. But,
Well, and then there's also enforcement issues.
right, right,
And if it is not enforced, then.
right.
And I guess that, just a note about it, this doesn't impact anything about the agricultural, you know, the agricultural keeping of chickens is unchanged,
Yep.
but this would allow it in the single family. That's sort of the change here.
And would bring some people who are already doing this into compliance as well.
In theory, yeah. So unless, I don't know if anybody had any concerns reading through what I had sent, this language, you know, pretty much just the couple of restrictions that the board had discussed. But unless there's anything else, I can scroll down to the next one.
I'm pretty happy with this.
You know, some people have pet pigs. You know, these little
Yeah.
pet pigs. Is there anything about them, or are they okay?
I think this briefly came up in our conversations. I mean, you can have pets.
Right.
And I think a pet is defined differently, and I haven't looked at the definition. Do we have a definition of pet? It's different than an agricultural animal, and I don't even know.
Yeah, I think the key is that, you know, animal and poultry husbandry is under agriculture specifically.
As opposed to a pet.
So I don't think it gets, yeah. I couldn't say right
Yeah, a
off the
pet
top of my
cow.
head, to be honest.
Pets have names, agricultural animals don't.
I used to name my cows.
There you have.
I guess the next one, sort of self-explanatory. While you're looking at that, I can start talking about this one. It's just a couple of, you know, this is the change that FEMA essentially sent us. Actually, it was the state of New Hampshire, Office of Strategic Initiatives, did a sort of compliance review of our floodplain ordinance, found that a couple of our definitions needed to be updated. A couple of our standards were not in compliance with what their current requirements are. So, you know, in order to keep ourselves in conformity with the National Flood Insurance Program requirements, these changes are specifically the changes that they recommended after their audit. It's mostly definitional, the way they define, you know, various
More
pieces.
100-year floodplain,
I'd have to look.
right?
Yeah, they call it the base base flood.
It used to be called 100-year, you know, typically we call it the 100-year floodplain, but the technical term is base flood elevation, because that's what's designated on the flood map. So as Joseph said, that was all changes that we pretty much have to do to be made part of the National Flood Insurance Program. So there isn't a lot of, you know, they actually provided these specific changes. So it's more a matter of making sure that the voters agree to it. Otherwise, we may lose the ability, people could lose the ability to purchase flood insurance, so. And this happens from time to time. I don't think they've done an audit for a while, but because of the Pemi River area here is in the new flood maps are in the works. It's a multi-year process for all the engineering and assessment of it. So I think there's actually currently a public comment period, but you can only really submit comments if you have technical like fluvial evidence that their measurements have changed, because they've been spending multiple years really looking at the river and the river basin watershed. So with that adoption of new maps, they're going to all the towns within the watershed and looking at the regulations more closely.
The Pemi River,
And so just as we're looking for the next amendments here, on that piece, they also looked at our site plan review and our subdivision regulations, and those seem fine. And it was just this stuff in the zoning ordinance here.
So the next piece.
I just wanted to say the Pemi River Local Advisory Committee is working on a master plan update, and that includes the FEMA standards.
Thank you.
The next sort of change is really, I mean, the way it fits in the ordinance is just that it removes a section that is no longer needed. Accessory family dwelling, it's a use that isn't permitted as a special exception, permitted as a conditional use permit. It was, it's been replaced with accessory dwelling unit. So really this just causes confusion for people when they're looking through the ordinance, because it's accessory family dwelling and it has a set of standards that no longer apply because the new standards are found in the accessory dwelling unit section. So there's
We
really,
really should have removed that when we approved the accessory dwelling unit concurrently.
yeah, there's
We're
no,
just cleaning stuff up now.
Yep.
yep, it's just a real cleanup of something that is no longer needed.
Good.
So what's gonna replace it?
Oh, it's already there.
Already
to
there.
replace it.
Oh,
Yeah.
Yeah.
it's already.
The state actually required that towns could not prohibit accessory dwelling units, so we had to create an allowance for it.
And that happened several years ago. I don't remember what year, but it's been a few years, so
3 or 4 maybe?
yeah, at least, yeah.
And those are currently permitted by a conditional use permit from the planning board. So, this certainly doesn't change that or really touch that process at all, and the standards that they're subject to are, the same. The next piece is kind of similar more to the FEMA portion, the variance criteria. There have been a number of changes to the variance criteria over the years. Our criteria in our ordinance didn't quite reflect what the text of the RSA stipulated for criteria, so this just sort of substitutes the most recent RSA criteria. There's not much substantively changed that I really can pick up on. There is one provision that is going to be new that wasn't mentioned in the ordinance. That's the allowance to grant a variance when there's not a hardship, if there is the need for reasonable accommodations for a person with a physical disability, to allow their use of the premises. So that is one change that could is a bit of a change from what's written. The rest is
It makes it more ADA compliant.
Yeah, it's allowing for, I think the intention is, if you need a variance to install a ramp, you don't need to find that there's a hardship to grant the variance.
Does our zoning ordinance deal with appeals beyond variances? Or is that simply left to statute?
Like a appeal to like a superior court?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's all out of statute.
Okay, because, I mean, that has changed in the past. Now, appeals go to a land use review board, not the Superior Court, but I just wanted to make sure that we didn't specify one or the other. Leaving it to statute is cleaner.
Yeah, and this similarly just, make sure that what we're reading when we review a variance is the same as what the state statute has for standards, so that, should that ever happen, everything is consistent, everybody's looking at the same set of rules. It just replaces the old variance criteria, and adds that new piece about the hardship for physical disability. Again, I don't know if there's really any discussion about this one beyond
No.
that. I think it's
No.
relatively straightforward. And those are them, unless there is one other.
There was a handout.
Yes, there's a handout. So one other piece that's sort of been brought to our attention, those are the 7/8 ones that the board has previously sort of vetted, talked about, considered. We've made some changes to, and that's sort of what the board has up until this point agreed upon. One thing just to sort of be aware of, and that has come to our attention, is this new piece about, and it's in front of you now. There's a portion of the zoning ordinance that deals with off-site parking areas. So this is if you have a particular use on one piece of property and you'd like the parking for that use to be on another piece of property. That's allowed in every zone except for single-family residential by a special exception. It, like many other uses, has a separate set of special exception criteria. And the fourth of those criteria, as you can see on sort of the handout in front of you, is that actually the off-site parking has to be within 300 feet of the use that it's providing parking for. And, it's sort of come to our attention, it sort of, in looking at this, it's not a piece that comes up too often, but there are probably a lot of cases where, it could make sense to have something more than 300 feet away that's still easily accessible from the primary use. And on the other side, there could be situations where a proposed off-site parking area is less than 300 feet away, but it's still not reasonable to access from, the primary use. So our thought was a change to this, and, it's late. We know the board has already considered a number of amendments, so, it's sort of at the board's discretion if you want to take this up as another one, but we could make a change that instead of a hard cutoff of 300 feet, it says reasonably and safely accessible as the criteria that the zoning board has to meet, in addition to all of the others. That way, if there's a situation where, a property could be on one side of, a very busy road or a river or something like that, and you try to have a off-site parking area, and the, 300 feet could mean that it's really practically not feasible for use, and it could be put pedestrians, the users, at risk trying to get to it. On the other hand, there are situations where, it could be very easily accessible from the primary use and slightly over that 300 feet. So we thought that might be a better criteria for that than a hard cutoff in terms of number of feet.
It gives the zoning board greater flexibility to use their judgment rather than just follow a number.
Right.
Which makes sense.
Yeah, so it's, we kind of wanted to just bring this up to the board and see if this was something that the board wanted to take on and, add to the list of amendments to be considered. It's a pretty small change. It's just the wording in one.
I like the proposed change to Roman 4. I was trying to think about other situations where this may be needed even within the single-family residential, and one does come to mind. If you're familiar with the parking lot for Spear Hospital that's on the corner of Cummings and Langdon, that's probably a situation, they probably had to get a variance for that one if it's not on the same parcel as the hospital. Because if that's an example where if the hospital were on one parcel and the parking lot were on another one, that is an off-site parking, but it's within the single-family residential where, we could remove except single-family residential from the definition at the top to allow it by special exception in any zone.
I'd be a
It
little,
still requires a special exception. It's not, what do you think about that, June? I see your thinking.
Yeah, I actually think the Spear situation, it's multifamily probably. I'd have to, I don't have this map. It's not single family, I don't think, so.
It's close.
Civic institutional maybe, or something like that, I don't know.
Okay.
And they are budding properties, the one on Langdon Street kind of, abuts the hospital, so I think that's actually a very, I believe it abuts, must.
Yeah.
But I don't think we want to promote off-site parking facilities in the single-family zone. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
I mean, so you could have think about it like maybe on Highland Street, if you had something, could you put a parking lot behind it in a single-family zone? I don't know, I'd have to think, we'd have to kind of look at the map more closely, but the main issue here is like when we have these situations where somebody wants to do a parking facility, the 300 just seems like a really arbitrary number. We couldn't figure out why it was 300, and just trying to change the text to, as Joseph said, to be reasonable and accessible. Makes more sense, because you could have something 50 feet away on the other side of Tenny Mountain Highway. That's not reasonable to have somebody be able to park on one side and cross the street to go to work on the other side, where there's no crosswalk. And so that was really more the thinking
I was
about
also
it.
just going to add that, maybe in the long run, we'd say even single-family residential would be okay, but it's a little bit short notice to try to make that judgment right now.
Yeah.
This seems like a no-brainer to make this judgment. And we're also currently in the middle of a housing study, and
Right.
there are going to be regulatory recommendations coming out of this, and we can let that process run its course to kind of think more broadly about those sorts of issues. But I think it would be abrupt to make the single-family residential choice tonight.
Okay.
Even if it is a good idea, I think it's just not
Thank
enough
you for
time to
entertaining my
think through
discussion
it.
topic. That's all I wanted to do, is
Yeah.
just bring it up and see what the board thought. I'm happy to let it go.
Did you have a thought, Mike?
yeah, I'm just thinking, maybe we could look at this, but I think to bring it in at this late stage when we're already doing so much, I think maybe it's worth it to revisit in a year or so.
We
But,
mean this, you mean,
The parking,
parking
the
in town.
off-street more than 300 feet.
okay.
I'd like to have some idea of, someone's got something on their mind, and I don't know where this came from, and maybe it's just June, I don't know.
Mike,
But
are you aware that this is already in the zoning ordinance?
more than 300 feet is what I'm
Yeah.
talking about. It's not, it's limited to 300 feet right now.
Right,
Yeah.
but what the proposed change would actually make it easier for the planning department, for the zoning board to
I get
consider
that.
it. Okay, all right.
So I would say I'm not willing, I think that would be best for this planning board to wait on this, and maybe a year or two, if it's still something that's pressing, to look at it then, but I'd hate to, we're already doing a lot, and this is not something we need to be looking at. We've never had, that I can remember on the planning board, anybody come forward and say, this is an issue, so.
I would say it may or may not be pressing, but it seems like an easy change, and
I think
I
you
don't
find a
really-
lot of opposition.
I don't really see a downside to this. And if there's opposition, we can pull it or it'll fail, but I'm personally in favor of maybe going forward. June?
So when we, as, staff, bring these things forward to you, there's a combination of why they come up of, we see things in our day-to-day or weekly, just work with the ordinance. But most of the time it's triggered by a request or questions that we get. And then, Joseph and I had a fairly lengthy discussion about this just earlier this week, because we had a situation where somebody's trying to do the right thing and support a property by having some more parking somewhere else. So they were asking about it, and we realized they technically, by reading this, need a variance, and that just, there was no reason why, you know what I mean? And then we started thinking more, then we're not trying to do something to help one owner. It brings up the question of why this is in the ordinance. So then we start looking at the map, thinking about where else this could happen, how can we make it more accommodating to support support different types of property uses. So it's not, I just want to, and that was the language we came up with, that really the 300 feet seems to be completely arbitrary. There's no, you can't figure out any reason why it would be that. So we just wanted to do something that actually would help everybody, the zoning board, staff, property owners, understand that there should be a reasonable connection for where parking is going to be, and it should be safe and accessible and not just some arbitrary number.
Which gives more flexibility to the zoning board.
So we come up
Actually
with a
use
different
their-
arbitrary number.
No,
No,
we
it's not up
remove
to
the
us.
arbitrary number.
It's up to the zoning board.
And the zoning board
to
gets to use
determine.
their judgment and their brains instead of just
So,
a measuring tape.
right now, do they have to have a hardship to get a special exception?
No, that's a variance requirement, not a
Yeah.
special
Okay.
exception requirement.
But if they're going to have a parking facility 350 feet away from the proposed use it's going to serve, then they need a variance, which they probably can't get.
Right.
That's what's an issue. If you're within the 300 feet, you can probably get the special exception, maybe, depending on the circumstances. But if you're 302 feet away or 310 feet, then you can't even, you can't, it doesn't meet those criteria. So you'd actually not be applying for a special exception. You'd have to apply for a variance to have a parking facility more than 300 feet away.
And the other thing about safely and reasonably accessible is that, like, in theory, there could be, a business that's on the other side of the baker, and you could have a parking lot within 300 feet on the other side, but it's certainly not accessible. Whereas,
Yeah.
in one situation, requiring it be reasonably and safely accessible might apply to situations where it's less than 300 feet, and it would still be better than the current standard.
And it doesn't say where the 300 feet is measured from. It could be the back corner of one lot to the back corner of another.
Yeah.
And then to actually get there, you're driving, down one street and up another and across another, to get to it. So just something to think about. We know that this is late, but we just feel like there was still ample time. The public hearings haven't been even noticed for any zoning amendment changes. So we were just trying to do something we always hear the town wants more parking, so trying to find a way to help support that.
How do you guys feel?
Table it.
What's that?
I think we should table it.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was on the parking committee for Main Street, and we were looking for anywhere we could find parking, and Joe at the town highway said, well, I'll provide, I think, 9 spots, that the closest that we could find, and it was within 100 feet of the storefronts in downtown on the Village Commercial. Guess how many people used those 9 spots? 0. No one used it, Joe said, because it's a long distance and it's intimidating for a lot of people to walk that distance for a parking lot. And I think 300 has served us well for a number of years, and I think to throw this out right now, I think it's something we can wait on.
I know the post office has a problem with parking
They do.
for their employees.
Nothing's going to prevent us from bringing it back in a year and looking at it again if we want to, but for now, I think this is something, again, I agree with Mike. And I agree with Neil.
I personally don't see any downside to giving us more flexibility, and putting it in the hands of someone's judgment rather than just some number we found. And there are cases where 100 feet might not work, and then the zoning board could even say, like, no, in this case, 100 feet doesn't even work. But there are cases where people will be willing to walk a little bit further, depending on the conditions and the site there and what that looks like, and maybe 310 feet would be just fine. I mean, it could happen, 310 feet, you know, like, oh, now we need a variance.
400, 500, yeah.
Well, this zoning board considers variances.
They're also much harder to get. And if we do want to promote downtown as a walkable space, I don't think, I think this is a way of encouraging that. It might be more than 300 feet sometimes, and I think if the zoning board says that's reasonable in that instance, based on their criteria and their judgment, and I think that human element is a whole lot more valuable than just a number. So it makes sense to me, and it doesn't seem, in my mind, like it's...
If we propose this and move it to public hearing, we do not have to
Push it to the next phase.
push it to
No.
town meeting.
We do not.
But if we don't propose this, we can't.
Yes.
I would propose that we include this change. I'll make a motion that we include this change in the next draft and notice public hearing. And if the board, if after the public hearing process, the board decides that we're not in favor of moving this forward, we won't push it to the voters at town meeting.
Which is implicit anyway, because that's always our process.
We have multiple steps along the way at which we could stop. But if we don't move forward, we can't go. So I would say let's move forward with this proposed change and get feedback from the public on it. And then if we decide later not to move forward, we can pull it back from the voters before town meeting, or before we print the ballots.
Is that a motion?
It's a motion.
Second?
Okay, so we have a motion and a second to bring this to public hearing and include this in our amendments. Is there further discussion?
Yes, so a 3-3 tie would mean that it doesn't carry.
Okay.
Unless June's gonna vote.
So now this means it will go to the public hearing and we'll get the public's input about,
This would allow us to go to the public and have a hearing. And then at some point, after the public hearing, the board still has to vote to put it to the voters if we,
This does not automatically trigger this going to the voters. It just brings it to the next step of having a public hearing.
so I guess the only other question, and I hope it's the appropriate time to ask this, is why is this just coming up? I guess I just don't understand
Well,
that.
I think June was just explained there was an application, or somebody talked to her, where they wanted to put parking, which seemed reasonable, a little bit more than 300 feet away, and they were looking at that, and which raised the broader issues, if I'm speaking correctly here, about the applicability of this piece of the ordinance more generally. So it wouldn't be like we're just doing this for this one person, and our timeline might not even fit this one person in getting this approved. But more broadly speaking, there could be more cases like this where some greater flexibility would be helpful.
And I understand that, but I guess if someone wants to do this, why, are they going to go through the process to get a special exception to do more than 300 feet? Or are they gonna still go through the process because that's the way it is now? Or are they just not gonna do anything because this is the way it sits?
as it's currently written, if somebody wanted to put a parking area in that was 305 feet from
Right.
their primary business, they would have to seek a variance.
And a variance is very difficult to get.
A variance is a harder standard to meet than a special exception, whereas if we were to move forward with the proposed change, it would be up to the zoning board could still consider it as a special exception as long as they thought that 305 feet was a reasonable and safely accessible distance.
So it is still doable.
Yeah.
As a variance
Just
right
ma-
now.
It just makes it easier for
And
the
depending on,
ZBA.
for this particular individual, it depends on their timeline, if they want to wait for this process or not. But,
So
Again, I would suggest, sorry to interrupt, but I think while this issue has arisen and because of an inquiry we had, we're not trying to do something for one individual. Joseph and I stepped back and spent a fair amount of time kind of philosophically looking at, does this make sense? And we did. I mean, to be honest, I've got probably 5 pages of handwritten notes of thing. We could bring you a zoning question that comes up probably every month with suggested amendments. If we were trying to accommodate something for individuals, we often see things and we tell people, hey, you need a special exception, you need a variance, it's not a permitted use, whatever. That doesn't mean we always come back to the planning board saying, hey, we ought to change this. We only do that when we kind of can't. We do think about it more broadly, but many of these things are triggered from questions that we get, and that was the case in this one, and we just felt there was still time to address it. I mean, it doesn't really matter to me. I just don't want you guys to think that we're trying to do this for one person. It was more looking at it more globally than that. And these things come up all the time. That's generally, that's why we have the chicken issue this year, because it's come up. So we put something together and bring it forward to you guys.
So my thought is, we're right up against Christmas. Everybody's busy. Everybody's got things that they're doing. And Mike's alluded to it, that this is something we can look at a year down the road and not have to force it right at Christmas time. So my thought is, I think it's best for the town, best for everybody trying to go about their lives, to wait a year to look at this. That's what I'm saying.
I'm not sure anybody is forcing this at Christmas time. We're looking at all of our amendments right now. And this in many ways seems like a fairly, like you mentioned, the single-family residential. That seems like a much bigger discussion, much more complicated, and I would not want that to be on our plate right now. To me, this seems like a kind of minor
It's not minor
change that
for a
would
lot of people.
give a lot more flexibility to the zoning board to make decisions based upon their judgment.
And the fact that it's still allowable by variance means that it still can happen for someone.
Okay, so is there further discussion?
I like the idea of having a public hearing and giving citizens an opportunity to come and express their feelings on this, pro or con.
When would the hearings be, if we're talking about a hearing?
January. And we have to have public hearings anyway, because we have zoning amendments and we have to have public hearings. And so those are happening regardless. So the question is whether or not we want to add this one extra amendment.
So all the other amendments have been going on for months and months and months. And now all of a sudden this.
Amongst us.
None of the public hearing.
None of them have gone to the public yet.
So this will just get thrown in with all the other ones, and at least we'll be able to get public input, which I think is really important.
Right, and you can have a public input a year down the road, but to throw this in, I think you're gonna find that I would like to vet this a lot more than just throwing this out now. And it could be something just seems a little off with this, more than 300 feet. It's already allowed up to 300 feet. It's, you can get a variance if need be. But this change, I want to know a whole lot more before we start
And this also,
pushing this for March.
the current ordinance also allows parking lots that are 100 feet away and dangerous to go in. I mean, it would still be up to the zoning board to actually approve that, so, but.
It's just too short notice.
So we have a motion and a second to bring this to public hearing with the rest of the zoning ordinance amendments. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
Nay?
Abstentions? Okay, the motion is approved. I've lost my, where did it go? I think I remember, I've lost my schedule for the evening. I think up next
Agenda.
is the HOP committee,
Yes.
which I, of course, jumped the shark on, and I don't know if that's the right
That's a
phrase
big
here,
deal.
but I did it with the other committees.
Yeah.
So I think.
Can I just add one thing after the discussion we just had? I
Yes.
think this HOP thing, this housing, is really going to give us a lot of information about where we need to go with parking, with our regulations. I almost feel like, I was discussing it with Joseph at one point, that it's almost going to put the cart back in back of the horse. Right now, it seems like this housing thing, we can go ahead and provide all we want out there for this, but I think this is gonna show us that we really need to do a lot more to get this stuff to come to the town.
And give us the resources to help.
Right,
get
and I do
through it.
think that this grant process is gonna at least give the information and have people listen to professionals that are giving us the information as opposed to just listening to.
I would like to say that I appreciate the time that you are all putting in on this.
Pretty interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I look forward to hearing the outcome from the consultant.
Yeah, hopefully pretty soon.
Good.
All right, is there any other unfinished business from board members or members of the planning staff?
None on our end.
All right. At this point, if there are any public comments, thank you for holding out there.
You stayed longer than everybody else. What's up with that?
No, I just got caught up in
You're hired.
I'm required
We're
to
always
be here
looking
by
for more
class,
people.
but I enjoy being here nonetheless.
Wow.
We're always looking for,
What's your class?
It's called planning,
community planning.
community planning, sorry, yeah, you came in and
Yeah.
spoke to the class about it, and I waited till the last town meeting to
Yeah.
come to one, but I enjoy this stuff, I'm tempted to get my planning career, so.
Well, come again.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Have a good one.
Right.
Did you find your agenda?
I did find my agenda. We have a motion to adjourn?
Yeah.
Do we have any other unfinished business?
I think
No.
June's trying to
Oh,
get
June, are
some.
you trying to get?
There's no second
Oh,
yet, so we're
June.
good.
Yeah, I apologize. I actually just want Joseph to check his email because we just got an important email that he needs to read, so. Before he leaves, so, sorry, Joseph.
This is not to the board, this is just for Joseph?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Some of the students miss out on the good stuff.
I know.
Yeah? All right, so we have a motion.
Do we?
Yeah. I
There's a
made
motion.
Adjourn?
I'll second.
Second.
Um,
Sue got it.
all in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
Oh,
Okay, the meeting is adjourned.
Mike, we appreciate your input.